All right, let's get straight into it. If you're studying AQA/AS psychology, you know this is a massive topic. Defining abnormality is a cornerstone of psychopathology, and honestly, getting these 4 key definitions down and knowing how to critique them is absolutely crucial for your exam. So let's break it all down.
Here's our game plan. We're going to take a really systematic walk through each of the 4 definitions you need to know. We'll cover all the essential AO1 knowledge, but, and this is the important part, we'll really dig into the critical evaluation points, the AO3 stuff that's going to make your answers really stand out.
So first things first, before we even look at the definitions, we've got to understand why this is such a headache for psychology in the first place. I mean, why isn't there just one simple, clear-cut answer?
And here it is, the fundamental problem. Defining what's normal isn't like measuring something in a science lab. It's not an objective fact. It's a judgment call. And that judgment totally changes depending on the area you're in, the culture you're from, and the specific situation. So let's explore the 4 main ways psychologists have tried to tackle this.
Okay, our first definition is all about the social world. It sees abnormality not as some internal flaw, but as a behavior that just doesn't fit in with the accepted rules of the group.
This right here is a core concept, your bread and butter AO1 knowledge for the exam. Basically, deviation from social norms is any behavior that breaks the rules, written or unwritten, of a given society. You can think of it as violating the social contract we all implicitly agree to.
And these norms come in 2 flavors. You've got your explicit ones. These are the things written down, like actual laws. Then you have the implicit norms, which are way more subtle. They're the unwritten rules we all just kind of know, like the classic British example of queuing. Break either of these and you risk getting labeled as abnormal.
Okay, so we've got the definition down, but for the exam, that's only half the battle. You have to be able to pull it apart, to critique it. That's where you'll scoop up all those juicy AO3 marks. So, what are the biggest issues with this whole approach? The biggest, most powerful criticism you can make is cultural relativism. Social norms are not universal. They are completely tied to a specific culture. This means what's seen as perfectly normal and acceptable in one part of the world might be seen as profoundly abnormal in another. It makes it impossible to have a single global standard for what's normal.
And it's not just about where you live, it's also about when you live. Norms are constantly changing. What was abnormal 50 years ago might be normal today. Plus, and this is a really sharp critique, breaking a norm isn't always a sign of a mental health problem. Sometimes it's just eccentricity. And other times, it's a vital act of rebellion, like the suffragettes, whose abnormal behavior was actually the engine for positive social change.
Now this is a fantastic example to drop into an essay. William Spooner, famous for mixing up the first letters of words, what we now call Spoonerisms, wasn't seen as mentally ill. He was seen as a charming eccentric. His case is a perfect illustration of that blurry line between being an individual and being what this definition might wrongly call abnormal.
And hey, don't just take my word for it. The textbook itself is giving you a massive clue here. Using well-chosen specific examples is what separates a decent answer from a top-band one. It proves you don't just know the theory parrot fashion, you can actually see how it applies in the real world.
All right, let's shift gears and look at our second definition. This one moves the spotlight away from society's rules and zooms right in on the individual and how they're coping, or not coping, with their own life. So, according to this definition, abnormality is all about being unable to handle the basic demands of everyday living. You know, things like getting up for work, maintaining relationships, and keeping yourself clean. The crucial part of this definition is that this inability to cope causes real suffering either for the person themselves or for the people around them. Now, to make this idea a bit more solid, Rosenhan and Seligman came up with these features of dysfunction. And look, you don't need to memorize the entire list, but being able to pull out and explain 1 or 2, like personal distress or observer discomfort, is a fantastic way to add that extra layer of specific detail to your exam answers. So at first glance, this definition seems really practical, right? It makes a lot of sense. But again, we've got to put our critical hats on. Does not being able to cope always mean you have a psychological disorder? And this is the absolute killer evaluation point. Context is everything. Someone on a hunger strike for a political cause is clearly failing to function, but it's a deliberate choice, not a sign of mental illness. And then you get the chilling flip side. You have someone like Dr. Harold Shipman, a serial killer, who, on the surface, was a respected, successful, highly functioning doctor. It just goes to show this definition can miss people who are seriously unwell and wrongly label people who are not. Okay, on to definition number 3.
This time, we're throwing out the social rules and the personal feelings. We're getting cold, hard, and mathematical. This is a purely statistical approach.
The logic here is incredibly simple. If a behavior is rare, it's abnormal. That's it. It's a numbers game. You work out what's average or typical for a large group of people, and anyone whose behavior is statistically unusual or uncommon gets defined as abnormal.
This graph, the normal distribution curve, is the perfect way to picture it. For most traits, like height or IQ, most of us are all clustered around the average in the middle. According to this definition, the people who are abnormal are the ones way out at the extreme ends, in what we call the tails of the curve, just because there aren't many people like them.
So it seems super scientific, doesn't it? It's objective, it's based on data, but does this numbers-first approach actually work when we're talking about something as complex as human behavior? Let's get into those crucial AO3 points.
So here's the deal. Its biggest strength is its objectivity, no doubt. But its biggest, most catastrophic failure is that it completely ignores whether a rare trait is a good thing or a bad thing. Having a genius-level IQ is just as statistically abnormal as having an extremely low one, but we would never call it a problem. And on top of that, who decides where rare actually begins? The cutoff is totally arbitrary. Right, for our final definition, we are going to do a complete 180. We're going to flip this whole thing on its head. Instead of starting with what's abnormal, this approach tries to define what is normal, or even ideal.
This is a totally different way of thinking, much more positive, much more humanistic. It basically says, hey, let's stop obsessing over what's wrong with people, and let's create a checklist for what perfect psychological health looks like. Abnormality, then, is simply anyone who doesn't meet all the points on that checklist.
So the psychologist Marie Jahoda came up with this idea, and she proposed these 6 criteria for what ideal mental health is. It includes things like having a positive view of yourself, growing as a person, being able to handle stress. But, and this is the massive catch, to be considered normal by this definition, you have to tick every single one of these boxes.
Just take a look at that list again. It's incredibly demanding, isn't it? So think about it. What happens when you set the bar for being normal that ridiculously high?
And that leads us straight to the main criticisms. First, the standards are so high that almost everybody on the planet would have to be considered abnormal. I mean, who has a completely accurate perception of reality all the time? And second, these ideas are very much rooted in Western individualistic cultures. Concepts like self-actualization aren't the primary goal in many collectivist cultures, which makes this definition culturally biased.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground, so let's wrap this up by pulling all the key bits together. This section is all about getting these crucial evaluation points locked in, ready for you to use in an exam.
This table here is absolute gold. Seriously, pause here, take a screenshot, write it down. This is your high-impact revision tool. It boils down the most powerful AO3 criticism for each of the 4 definitions. If you can remember and explain just these 4 points, you are going to be in such a strong position for any question on this topic.
And I'll leave you with this final thought to help you prep. Really think about this question. Of these 4 definitions, which one do you personally think is the weakest, the easiest to tear apart? There's no single right answer, but the process of deciding and justifying your choice, that is exactly the kind of critical thinking that scores top marks. Good luck with the revision.